My name is Tony Orsini. I was in the car with Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Moody and their 3 children, Tommy Jr. 4, Jimmy 2, and Sean 6 months, when Margaret Honey Moody lost her life. That evening, March 6, 1963, 5 people working the night shift at the Turner Stanton Mill, which was in the path of the raging floodwaters, also lost their lives. 3 other people working that night survived. I'd like to point out the southeast corner of the dam that burst that night from the heavy rains and the pressure of the ice. And that is down in that corner there. That's where it burst and took the path down to Norwich through Franklin Square. Today, August 24th, 2020, we start our historic walk at Spaulding Pond, Mohegan Park, which burst 57 years ago, taking a path through downtown Norwich. We stand here by a permanent monument commemorating the 6 lives of the victims of that tragedy, which was dedicated in 2006 with a memorial service. I'd like to read what the monument says with the inscription and the names. It reads, "In memoriam, this monument is dedicated to those who lost their lives to the sudden flood caused by the collapse of the Spaulding Pond Dam, March 6, 1963. The 6 people that lost their lives: Madeline Atterbury, Margaret Honey Moody, May Rabidou, Anna Barrett, Alexander Popel, and Helen Rood. I'd like to thank Dan Kelly, a friend of Tom Moody Sr., who both brought up the idea of this memorial to the city of Norwich. They got an immediate response. The Public Works commissioned the memorial and paid for it. They allowed Mr. Kelly to choose the spot where it stands today within view of Spaulding Pond. He also wrote the inscription. Dan, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, sure. Well, I got the idea originally when I was walking up here quite a bit, and I ran into Dick Lathrop, who was the mayor at that time, and I proposed the idea to him. He was all for it, set up all of the details to be done down in City Hall, and then, well, there was a transition where Ben Lathrop took over. I don't know if they're related at all, but he took over and got the ball rolling. And then the funds were appropriated by the city of Norwich. Everything worked out well. It was a freezing cold day that day. We came here for the original back there. It was terrible cold. But, and I figured it would be the right thing to do to honor those lives that were lost. It was a terrible night, and those that are the age that remember, it was quite a night. And then the city of Norwich took over, cleaned it up. It took a while, of course, but all in all, this memorial is for those people. And that's about it.
At this time, Roberta Vincent, our walk leader, assisted by Mike and John Wagner, will talk about the history of Spaulding Pond and the path of the floodwaters down to Turner Stanton Mill, where the 5 lives were lost.
Good morning. My name is Roberta Vincent, and I am the walk leader for the Spaulding Pond Dam Flood Tour. Today marks 57 years, 5 months, and 18 days since the breach. So we are here at Mohegan Park near the dam, and I wanted to provide you with some history. The Spaulding Pond Dam in Mohegan Park was constructed from the earth itself. By 1963, the 8-foot-high, 220-foot-long embankment was more than 100 years old. In 1853, harnessing the power of water feed at the south end of what is now Mohegan Park promised to boost the prospects of downtown merchants by providing propulsion for their water wheels. So established Norwich businessmen Per Dyer, Spaulding, and Henry Allen went about the process of strengthening the earthen dam on the property that was built in 1833 with no eye towards engineering or design parameters. In 1906, Norwich officials took control of the vast acreage of Mohegan Park and the dam that held back the pond's 45 million gallons of water. It had rained heavily on March 5th, 1963. 1.7 inches of rain would fall overall. On March 6, 1963, between 6:15 p.m. and 9 p.m., Norwich Public Works Director Harold Waltz personally inspected the Spaulding Pond dams for seepage, which was a known problem. At 9:20 p.m., Director Waltz called the Norwich City Police Station, informing them of a dam leakage and that it might go. Norwich police started to spread the word of the potential dam collapse. At 9:25 p.m., WICH radio station was contacted to request that a citywide alert be broadcast. At 9:37 p.m. on March 6, 1963, the Spaulding Pond Dam collapsed.
My name is John Wagoner, and I lived on Baltic Street, which was just downstream of where the water went. Back in that day, there was a field down off of Baltic Street called Colonna's Field. When the dam broke, it followed a natural water course that came from here all the way down through the city of Norwich, which also turned into a sewer line and an outfall that went through the center of Norwich and back into the river down by the old Palace Theater. So when the water was released from the dam, it went and followed that brook all the way down. So as we get down to the lower ends, you'll see how it is related by how some of the streets and what they're named. But this pond is fed, if you can see back there, there's a cove. That is the feed, that is the brook. That was the natural brook that ran many years ago from here down to the river. When the dam broke, I was up here the very next day, and what was left, there used to be a trellis that ran the whole length of this dam. And not being a smart kid, I was up at the precipice on that side of the break. I had my arm wrapped around a cedar pole, what was left of the trellis. I was standing about this far from the edge, looking down into about a 30, 40 foot deep gap that was probably 50 or 60 feet wide, where it took out that whole section of the dam. I actually walked on the bottom of that pond because there was no water left. The only thing left was the natural course of that brook as it ran from there down through the center, right through here, and right back out there is still the outfall of what used to be a brook that ran through that parking lot and then down all the way to another pond, which we used to call the skating pond. So you can imagine all those millions of gallons of water with ice that was at least 3 foot thick. When it broke, when we were down on the end of Baltic Street where I lived, there were blocks of ice that were 4 to 5 feet long, 3 foot thick, laying in the road. So you can imagine the force of the water and these huge blocks of ice riding on the top of it all the way down into Norwich, hitting that mill. The mill was a block to that water course. And just the pounding of that water and those huge blocks of ice caused it to collapse. So as I described, this was the dam, but there was had to be an outlet to relieve pressure against the face of the dam. And it happened to be right down there. What is left of it is now with flood control on the opposite side. So there is still controlled amounts of water that are released, and you can see some of it flowing very gently down there. That used to be more vibrant back in the day. There was a nice brook that ran through here, through the parking lot and down. So they can relieve pressure on the dam by the flood control. There's a gate back there, so that's how they can control it and prevent that from ever happening again.
Bottom of the hill right here was a bunch of ducks in a pen. They had a bunch of geese and everything else in the pen there. And across the street was another pond that had goldfish in it. On the other side where the big hole is there was another pond. So there was like a little roadway between the two of these things here. So when that let go, went over there and hit the other pond, took that pond out, and then headed its course right down straight through that parking lot and turned to the left side of it and started headed down to the city, to the mills. So there was another pond below this pond that picked up some more water out of that little pond and then kept going on through. So it went through our backyard with the big sheets of ice and everything. We're lucky it was in our backyard, but it didn't get to the houses that we lived in. All right. You can see this is what the dam was here. See the stone and the dirt, which is contained in that water. When she blew, she came right through this thing and it came down. Yeah. So the elevation was low when you got to the other one.
So what I was talking about, you can see parts of the trellis. And this is where I was standing with my arms wrapped around one of those poles looking down into that gap where the water went through. And you can see it's probably over 100 feet wide. We are now at from the Spaulding Pond main dam to a lower pond, which back in the day used to be called the skating pond. And the configuration now is more designed for water control. This whole area, all the way back through here, was full of water. The outlet from Spaulding Pond is back there into that, back like a cove back there, is where the water course from the dam break in Mohegan Park came down here to this whole bowl full of water, which also had ice on it that was 3 feet thick. So when the water came through, it lifted the ice off of this pond on top of it, and the dam used to run across here. You can see down below there is a big culvert for the drainage from this pond. That was the outflow. There was a little box-like structure with boards in it that control the amount of water that came out of the pond back in the day. So when the water came, it came down through Natural Brook, which also was part of this pond, and went out over here, but it lifted all of that water that was in this pond. The dam never broke. It just lifted everything up and went over it. So it was like Niagara Falls up here. I came up running through a path that was over there through the woods, because Baltic Street's down the other end. I came out over there and got up over into here, right by the dam, so I know it was still intact. And I was watching that water just going in tremendous volume over the dam and down the brook and down towards Baltic Street, Hickory Street, and down into Columbus Square. But it didn't look anything like this. There was a lot more water and a lot more area, so that added to the volume of the millions of gallons up there.
We are standing on the grounds where the Turner Stanton Mill was built. These grounds where the mill stood, they were producers of twine, string, yarn, and other textile materials. It employed 50 people, of which 8 had been assigned the evening shift. The main flow of the flood consisted of ice, rocks, trees over Mohegan Park, and completely engulfed the baseball field where the present-day Mohegan Park apartments reside. The baseball field was previously Moore's Ice Pond, and earlier it was Bates Pond, so it was a pond. The floodwaters crossed over Hickory Street, City Garage on Brook Street, southerly Baltic Street, and Broad Street. The Turner Stanton Mill on the south side of Broad Street now was directly in its deadly path. At 10:14 p.m., the Turner Stanton Mill employee punch clock stops when all electrical power in the facility had been instantly lost in the 12-foot waterways, 12 feet. So all 8 workers rushed to the 3rd floor in mass confusion and chaos and started yelling out the windows for help. Firemen and rescue crews could not get through the avalanche of the water. Madeline Atterbury, Axel Coble, and Helen Rude were crushed and killed under the weight of the structure. Teresa Moretti, Jean Bunjewski, and Madeline Gordon were saved by a shelter of boxes and girders, which formed a lean-to. Anna Barrett survived the initial trauma, but she succumbed to her injuries 4 hours later. Carol Marie Robideau remained missing until the next day. She was found at Longo's funeral home, bottom floor. The flood waters had carried her from the mill through the playground down Franklin Street to the funeral home. Although the Longos heard moans, they were unaware where they were coming from and could not leave their home. We are currently at 55 Lake Street, the home of the Orsinis who lived upstairs. Tony Orsini, who was 19 years old at the time, lived with his mom and dad, and the Moody's lived downstairs. So it was Thomas Sr., called Ron, Honey, Margaret Moody, and their children, Tom Jr., Jimmy, and Sean. Tom was 4 years old at the time. Jimmy was 2. Sean was 6 months old. So at 9:30 p.m., Thomas Moody Sr. arrived home from working at the American Optical Company. 19-year-old Tony Orsini, who resided in the 2-story house above, had just arrived home from playing basketball. At 9:45, Thomas, who was called Ron, and his wife Margaret, heard a loud banging on the window in their living room. Someone from the Norwich Public Works had sent people out to warn people on Lake Street of the possible dam collapse. Honey decided to take her children to her mother's home on the west side of town with Tony Orsini's assistance. The water flow was already like chin deep as the children, Tom Jr., age 4, Jimmy, age 2, and Sean, 6 months, were loaded into the car. The car proceeded down Lake Street, rounding the corner. So you can imagine her concern about getting her children to the west side of town. So they would have followed this one-way street all the way down in order to go down Pond Street and head to the main street so they could get to the west side so her children would be safe. That was Honey and Tom's main concern, was to get their children safe. So this is the path that they would have followed. Honey was holding Sean in the front seat, and Tony was in the back with the other 2 boys. And certainly they had no idea. They knew that the dam had burst, but they had no idea of the direction or the volume of water that was coming or the loss of life that would take place. So they're coming to the corner that would take them down to Pond Street and eventually down to Franklin Street. As the car rounded this corner, Honey looked at Ron and she screamed his name. We are standing in Lake Street Playground. This was the playground where all the young people from Lake Street, such as Tony, Boswell Avenue, which is my family, Pond Street, all of the neighborhood kids, this is where we came, this is where we grew up, this is where we bonded and our families bonded. The night of the flood, I lived on 76 Boswell Avenue, which was right up here. So one of my sisters woke me up and told me, come see the water. So I got up and everyone else had gone to see the flood path. So I was alone. I stepped outside and what I saw is water coming through this playground level, higher than the basketball rims. It came with such force and I could hear people screaming, and I always believed it was the people who lived level with the playground trying to get out. The Quimbys lived on the street. We had so many families. And I had a sister who was 6 months old. Her name was Doreen. So my mother and father weren't in the house. I didn't know where the water was coming from. I went into the bedroom. I dressed her in her snowsuit. I grabbed her, put a coat on, ran out the front door, ran up the steps, and my family caught me. That's how I panicked. The same panic that the Moody family and the Orsini family had, getting her children to the west side of town so that they could be safe. So my family got me, they brought me back home, and then we just watched the flood the rest of the night. It was such an eerie night. What an eerie feeling. It was cold, it was wet, it was damp. And so that's what I remember of the flood. Also, if you look at this big tree standing here, beyond that is where the Turner Stanton Mill was. So once the water went through the Turner Stanton Mill, it came through the playground.
There was a built-in brook inside the sewer line too, so there was water underneath in another tunnel. This tunnel came from all the way up from Baltic Street, ran down Lake Street. From Lake Street, it takes a left and heads right to the city. So there's a big tunnel all the way underneath. We're over on top of tunnels. And that's how our sewer system comes down. It's all gravity fed. There's no pumping station or nothing. So anything that came from this way was all water. Brooks were tied in, and that added more to the feature of this.
So this is the path. It was coming when Tom's car rounded the corner. Honey screamed, "Ron!" The floodwaters floated their car off the road, upward in a swirling mass, and carried them and dropped them off on Pond Street. So Tony, the car stopped. It was flipped over, and the car stopped, and Tony got out of the rear seat, first carrying young Tom. Ron climbed out the crushed front of the car. Honey was completely soaked, but still in the car. Honey grabbed Jimmy and handed him to Ron, who passed him on to Tony. So now Tony has both Tom and Jimmy, who were 4-year-old and 2 years old. Honey then grabbed baby Sean, who was floating in the car's interior, and passed him to Ron, who first cradled him and then passed him to Tony. The building where they were standing, on the roof of the building shifted. Tom lost his grip. Honey was swiftly swept away. Tony said, "Ron, she's gone." At that point, Ron would have probably tried to look for her, tried to save her, but the important thing was, once again, saving the children. So they spied this tree over here in the corner. They knew that the roof of the building was going to go. So after they spied the tree, which was just a yearling, they made it over to the tree. Tony had Sean zipped in his jacket. And then he had the hand of the boys, and they climbed into the tree, and they waited for hours to be rescued. So this was also Lamparell Motors. So there were 19 new cars and 20 used cars just floating. That was the strength of the water. And so Honey is gone, and the family is in the tree waiting to be rescued.
I was the youngest of 4 sisters, and they were all married at the time. So I was actually home alone with my father, and my mother, she was over my sister's house, which was on the east side. So when the floodwaters came, you know, Ronnie came up and asked me to help him, which I did, and I told my father, why don't you come with us? Him being an Italian from the old country, he said, I'm not moving. If the house goes, I'm going with it. And then once my mother heard about the flood, she came over and was standing on the top of Broad Street and Lake Street watching the flood, not realizing that I was involved in the car. That it was me in the tree. After 57 years, it's still very emotional for me to talk about the flood. I don't know how we survived. It was a miracle. I relived that night many times. Everything happened so fast. The raging floodwaters, being terrified, the tumbling of the car, struggling to get to safe ground. There were many acts of bravery that night. I was with the bravest person of all, Margaret Honey Moody. After the car was flipped over by a wall of water several times, it landed on its rooftop. She made sure the children were out of the water and on the building. All we needed was a few more seconds, and we would all be safe at that time. The building shifted. Tommy had a hold of his wife's hand, but when the building shifted, she fell through. And I clearly saw that she was swept away. I'm sure Mrs. Moody and Mr. and Mrs. Moody are looking down lovingly at their children and grandchildren and the entire Moody family. Mr. Moody passed away in 2009.
The Norwich Historical Society raised money to put a permanent memorial near the tree site. A dedication ceremony was held on July 26, 2014. Also on June 26, 2014, a shadow box that was built by Dougie Babbitt at Norwich Technical School was presented to Mayor Deb Hinchy. The shadow box is in City Hall on the 3rd floor. In the shadow box, there is a limb from the life-saving tree and a copy of this book. The inscription in the book states, "To the Tree of Life, Savior, longtime companion and stalwart friend. As I gaze out upon you during the few times when I have the opportunity to be home, I still remember your strength, fortitude, and life-saving grace. My family owes you our lives as you've grown these many years into a formidable Connecticut tree. I'm confident that in your youth, 51 years ago, you would still have been able to rescue one more. Thank you from one of those survivors, and here's wishing you a long life indeed, Thomas Moody." And this is the book that Tom authored. Although he was 4 years old, he went back and researched everything. He talked to many, many people in order to leave the history of the flood and his family and his mom to the city of Norwich. Welcome all to the Tree of Life. As we had stated, Tony Orsini, Tom, and the three children climbed into the V of the tree. Look where the V is now in 2020. It is way up there. Also, this tree is in the Arboretum, listed in the Arboretum at Connecticut College as a notable tree. So if you want to go and search the record, you will see that it is listed as a notable tree. The day of the dedication of the tree, we also had a sign that states Tony Orsini at the top because he is a hero.
In concluding, at this time, I'd like to thank the last Green Valley staff, Dan Kelly, a friend of Tom Moody Sr., Vivian Minor, and the Norwich Historical Society for making this possible. Roberta Vincent, our walk leader, assisted by John and Mike Wagner. Roberta and the Historical Society were instrumental in the dedication of the Tree of Life with a memorial monument. The Tree of Life entered into the Connecticut College Notable Tree Database. There is a shadow box at City Hall which contains a cutting of the tree to permanently remember the Tree of Life with other memorabilia, made possible by the local businesses and constructed by the Norwich Technical School. Lastly, the publishing of a swift and deadly maelstrom, the Great Norwich Flood of 1963, a survivor's story by Thomas Moody Jr., which tells in detail the history of Spaulding Pond up to the reconstruction of the dam and all the events in between. Thanks again.
The Tree of Life. On that fateful night, March 6, 1963, I was a mere sapling, bracing winter, with a slender trunk, tender branches, rooted in the soil on 299 Franklin Street. The Spaulding Pond Dam had just burst. Frigid floodwaters were approaching. That night, my destiny was sealed, miraculously becoming a Tree of Life. The Moody car lay overturned with the 6 of them. As the survivors climbed onto a roof, no longer able to hold Tom Sr.'s grasp, his beloved wife, Honey, slipped away. "She's gone," Tony murmured. As he grabbed Jimmy by the hand, Sean zipped safely under his jacket. Getting to safety was their immediate plan. I was spotted off in the distance. The roof and my height were the same. As they duck walked towards me, straddling the roof peaks, Tom Sr. held onto Tommy's hand. After climbing into the V of my trunk, the roof suddenly collapsed. It was gone. They continued to cry out for help, hoping someone would hear their sounds. The children were frightened, cold and wet. It was painful as I heard Jimmy's cries. I sheltered them for over an hour until the flood waters finally subsided. Prayers answered, they were rescued. Tony would eventually return safely home. Tom Sr.'s heart, filled with grief, remained at the hospital with his 3 sons. I have aged, but still permanently rooted in the soil on Franklin Street. 50 years ago, a tragic and now historic moment, having earned the honor of a notable tree.
In the waning hours of March the 6th, 1963, no one expected to end their day in a nondescript maple tree. But where could you turn With the deluge approaching, where might you find sanctuary with the torrent upon you? There was just one place, the crux of a life-saving tree. It was there in the right place, there at the right time, giving aid and comfort selflessly. That place of refuge where lives were saved, Norwich's life-saving tree. It stood strong enough as the flood swept by, just a lucky encounter, some say skeptically. It didn't reach down to lift up the victim, so how can we call it a life-saving tree? But consider the hero coming out of our midst, who says he was just where he happened to be, and who modestly adds, anyone would have done it, he only acted spontaneously. It was there in the right place, there at the right time, giving aid and comfort selflessly. That place of refuge where lives were saved, Norwich's life-saving tree. For those who survived the great Norwich flood, they know they were saved miraculously. 'Tis said if you're drowning, you'll cling to a straw, and if you're lucky to find one, a life-saving tree. We celebrate our first responders, all those who act heroically. So now it's time to recognize Norwich's life-saving tree. It was there in the right place, there at the right time, giving aid and comfort selflessly. That place of refuge where lives were saved, Norwich's life-saving tree. That place of refuge where lives were saved, Norwich's life-saving tree.